Before the war, I was a college student at McNeese State College then. I went to college to be a civil engineer. I didn't know anything about Vietnam except it was a spot on the map in Southeast Asia. When I was in college, there was the regular draft, and you had your choice. You could graduate and they would draft you, or you could volunteer and be in what we called advanced ROTC, and at that point they would commission you as a second lieutenant. So I chose to go in as an officer. The officer basic course that I attended was in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and it was a 3-month school where we took engineering courses and were introduced basically to Army engineering. We had some combat training during the officer basic course. It was physical training, live fire exercise, escape and evasion, all the basic things. When I deployed to Vietnam, I was 25 years old, and we landed at a place called Quy Nhon, Vietnam. Initially, I was stationed at Vinh Thanh at the Special Forces Camp 8228. I really didn't know what to expect, like everyone, and we were in the thick of it in about a week. We finally got our equipment off of the boat, and we got up to the Vinh Thanh area, and right there I realized what Vietnam was, what it was to be in combat, in the harsh conditions that we were looking at for another whole year. At Vinh Thanh, we were building an airstrip for the Special Forces, what we call CIDG, Civil Irregular Defense Groups. I was, at that time, a first lieutenant, so I was a platoon leader, and I had 50 people. And we were combat engineers, so we were really in the building mode, and we were in the fighting mode when we just had to. When I left the USA, I looked at my parents and my little sister and I said, I'll see y'all in 100 days. That's all I had left. But once I got to Vietnam, I somewhat had a change of the way I was thinking about things. And those 50 people that I had been with for so long, I said, they'll put a young lieutenant in charge of them and get every one of them killed. So again, Cochran raises his hand and says, I'm staying. So I voluntarily extended for another 7 months. And it started on the 30th of January, 1968. And where I was, it lasted about a week. But it was very, very bad. It was not a good time anywhere in Vietnam over what we call the Tet Offensive. It was the Lunar New Year, and of all things, we were in a ceasefire. I mean, both sides had agreed that this is a big holiday and we're going to take off. Then they attack us. And all the ARVNs were at home, and the only ones to fight was us Americans. We were very isolated from most everything, actually. You know, there was no news media. All we would get in the media was what we call the Stars and Stripes. Every now and then we'd get one of those Stars and Stripes, little newspapers. We knew there were protests all over America, but we didn't know just how bad it was. But we were quite aware that there were protests, and in some places there was some killings. We could not understand why the American public wouldn't support us. You know, in all the other wars and conflicts that we had been in, the American public was completely behind and supportive of what the fighting men were doing. That wasn't the way it was for us. Well, I remember the return trip really well. I'll never forget that ride, because there was about 3 of us, veterans, still in uniform, on the plane. The thing that stands out in my mind, there was a little girl, I guess she was about 2 or 3 years old, like that, and she was running down the pathway there of the plane, and she had come by and she'd look at all that shiny brass I had on me. You know how women are. When they see shiny things, it gets their attention. And I'd smile at her and I'd say hi or something to her. It wasn't long until her mother went to come got her. She didn't even want her around me. And I realized then, yes, they see the Vietnam all over you already. And I hadn't even got off the plane yet. When I returned from Vietnam, I did have trouble finding an employment. I actually went on 3 job interviews, and I did really well on all 3 of the interviews, but when it come time, they decided not to hire me. And they couldn't state the reason was just because I was a Vietnam veteran, but that's what it was, and I knew it. On the resumes, I got to where I wouldn't even put I was a Vietnam veteran. I'd just leave it blank. After Vietnam, and particularly Tet Offensive, my whole perception on life changed. At that point, I realized how fragile life really was in Vietnam. Just a small dividing line between living and dying. I was so concentrating on blowing things up with dynamite and doing this till my mind was pretty well occupied. But once I retired, here they are back at me, haunting me again. I can't get them out of my mind. So my life has really been affected by PTSD. Still is. It's the invisible wounds with me that are the most debilitating. You can't see them, you know, like PTSD. Most every disability that I have is directly related to Agent Orange exposure. One of the big ones is diabetes. You know, you can't see diabetes, but it affects your whole body. Another one is Parkinson's disease, peripheral neuropathy, and of course, ischemic heart disease. All of them directly related to Agent Orange. The thing I started up is a ceremony that we have. We started in 2012. We call it Welcome Home Vietnam Veterans Day. It's a ceremony to just specifically honor the service of Vietnam veterans. It's an awesome feeling, actually, that we've been able to educate the American public about that. We were actually fighting for our country just like everyone else. And all we ever asked for, we never asked but for one thing, that was respect. You know, we had never asked for anything from the public but respect, and that's what we wanted. And we're somewhat getting that now.